Hello everybody, welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host as always, Ricardo Lopes, and today my guest is Dr. Diane Halpern. She is Dean Emerita of Social Sciences at Minerva Schools at Keck Graduate Institute and former Emerita Professor of Psychology at Claremont McKenna College. She has won Honorary Awards for her teaching and research. She is also a past president of the American Psychological Association and the Society for Teaching of Psychology. Finally, she is the author of books like Sex Differences in Cognitive Abilities and Thought and Knowledge, an Introduction to Critical Thinking, which are exactly the topics that we're going to cover up today. So, Diane, thank you a lot for taking the time to come on the show.
Oh, thank you, Ricardo. I look forward to it.
Okay, great. So the first question I would like to ask you is, and since we're going to start talking about sex differences in cognitive abilities, why is it so important for us to study this topic, that is the ways in which men and women differ in terms of their cognitive abilities?
Sure, thanks. That's a great question, and often people will ask that, and there's really lots of reasons. First, if we learn about individual differences or group differences in cognition, regardless of what the group is, it advances our knowledge of cognition in general. It has also this particular question, this particular focus, has an incredibly important public policy, psychosocial kinds of implications. So, for example, we know that most occupations are predominantly female or predominantly male. What are the reasons why there are so few women, for example, in theoretical physics, and so few men in elementary school teaching or nursing? Is how much of that, if any of it, is in fact related to cognition? Many of our public policies are based on our intuitive beliefs about the way we answer this question. So if you look at almost all the public policies, in there's some inherent beliefs about the way women and men are similar. We want to also include similarities and the way in which they're different. Single-sex schooling, for example. Do boys and girls, are they so different in their learning they can't even learn together in the same classroom? They need separate classrooms. Do women and men, are they so different that in fact we need special affirmative action policies? Affirmative action is a very hot topic in a lot of places around the world. Is it right? What are the bases for it? And, how do we come to understand these differences? What about our child rearing practices? Should we let children, should we be giving boys Legos and girls dolls? And if we switch it, what have we done? Are we somehow changing generations of beliefs about the inherent differences between females and males? So there's really lots and lots of reasons why it is that this is an important question to answer. Another reason why it's important is that we have prejudices and we have stereotypes. We all have them, even if we're not even aware of them, even if we're not proud of them. And the only way we can fully attack or address prejudices and stereotypes is with data. What in fact is the truth? And truth is a funny word. I've often said in critical thinking that only people who have truth are philosophers and mathematicians. But what I really mean is, what is the evidence that supports what we're saying about group differences? Mm-hmm. So that was an answer to a short question.
No problem. It was a great answer. And by the way, I guess that for a long time now, and even nowadays as well, studying sex differences is always a very controversial topic. But in fact, we can use this science, the science of sex differences, even to diffuse sexist arguments, because perhaps women are better at doing some things and men at others, but in the end, it's not really that one of the sexes is superior to the other in most cognitive abilities, right?
Okay, well, that's a great lead-in. First, let's try to think about what you started about: women being better in some things, men being better in others. The problem with that statement, and it's one that I have casually made myself, the problem with that statement is that it overlooks the fact that when we do research, we look about average group differences, and nobody is average. What we need to remember is there's a tremendous amount of overlap among the distributions. So even if we were to conclude that on average, males are better at a certain kind of task, we don't want to then say women are not good at it, because there's huge numbers of women at both ends at the distribution. If we say women are better at the same task, we don't want to then exclude men and say, they shouldn't be getting custody during child cases because of, on average, attachment kinds of things. We really need to look at individuals. And when we treat groups as though, everyone in the group is the same, that is the exact basis of prejudice and stereotyping. Very hard to get away from that kind of idea, but very, very important, which is why every time I talk, I say on average many times, too many times. And I do that because I really want to get everyone to understand and hone in on the fact that we're not average. Another thing is what we find today doesn't tell us anything about why. It doesn't tell us anything about changing patterns and trends. So even if we were to conclude that women are on average better at something, it does not mean that we could not have created the gap socially. It does not mean that we could reduce it or eliminate it or enhance it through our rearing practices. So what we find today doesn't mean that's what we're going to find 10 years ago. If you look at, I'll give one of my former graduate students a plug. I'm very, very proud. I'm very proud of all my students. John Way did some incredible work looking at the upper tails of the distribution on standardized tests. And 1980s, when I started studying this, the ratio of males to females on some of these math tests was like 13-1. Now it's 3-1. So, certainly no gene travels that fast. What was the difference? Well, huge numbers of differences between 1980s and now, including the fact that we have more women getting advanced coursework in mathematics, those sorts of things. Will it ultimately go to 1-1? I don't know. I stay close to data. And I try, it's hard to know where the future trend is leading, but I have learned to be very humble, because I've written many editions of these books. And every time I write a new edition, I write, if you read my last edition, I said X. And now I have these new data, this new way of thinking about it. And now I'm saying, maybe I wasn't so sure in what I should have said, or maybe I now think Y is more likely true. And so I think we need to be humble in our understanding. And we also need to be much more globally inclusive. Certainly, we have much more cross-cultural data than we ever had, thanks to the internet, thanks to, I can easily talk to you in Portugal as though you were next door. That certainly is not used to be true. But what we find in Western industrialized countries is not necessarily true for the entire world, and we need to be much, much more inclusive. My colleague Fanny Chung and I are doing a new book for Cambridge on the International Handbook on Psychology of Women, where we have authors from all over the world, and we have teams of authors from different cultures working on different topics. And I think it is eye-opening when you consider, why did I never know about women in Bangladesh? Why did I never know about the third sex in Filipino culture? So there's so many things when we look outward also, like around the world, that may change our thinking.
Mhm. Yes, it's very interesting that you just referred to the fact that it is important for us to also include other cultures in this analysis, because as far as I am aware, at least recently, there have been out some studies that people have done across tens of cultures, and it seems that they get consistent results about the fact that it seems that in cultures, like for example, in the Nordic countries like Sweden and Denmark and other countries like that, that the effects in terms of sex differences in interests are larger than in countries where gender equality is not really taken into account, or at least not as much as in those countries. So it seems that in countries where we have more gender equality, the genetic effects have much more influence than the environmental ones. I'm not sure if I'm correct about this or not, but could you please talk a little bit about that?
Oh, sure. That is actually a very interesting point. First, when we talk about the effects, we have to say which ones. If we're looking at something like standardized test scores on international reading tests, if they are standardized across country, if we're looking at those kinds of international assessments, there is consistency with regard to the direction of differences. So, for example, on average, I told you I'm going to say that a lot, females, on these international reading tests do better than males at various grades across multiple countries. Now, the size of the sex difference varies. So, what is a small effect? I think there's only 2 or 3 countries where it's not statistically significant. And of course, I have those graphs and all those data. I perhaps should have had some graphs ready to show you. I could send them later if you like. The notion here, so the size of the difference is what matters. Now, what's interesting is you would expect when you look at gender equal countries, and there are measures of gender equality, World Health Organization, a variety, World Bank have various measures, and you would expect that those that are most gender equal would have the smallest differences. And that actually turns out to be truer for math, but not, for example, for reading or spatial skills. So you have to be you can't just make any kind of broad statement. It's what we call sort of the paradox of equality. One possibility is that in countries with more gender equality, everyone has more choice. And with more choice, there are lots of things that influences our choices. If, for example, you're excellent in, let's say, mathematics, and you're excellent in language skills, what do you select for a career? What are your interests? And a lot of those things really depend on cultural and individual background and those sorts of things. You have more leeway. Where you find some of the smallest differences are in some of the very poorest, least educated countries. Now, if you are a mathematician, you would say, sure, that's because you have a floor, what's called the floor effect. If you are poor, if no one is getting a good education, everyone's doing rather poorly, and nobody has a chance to develop any of their abilities. So in fact, you find some of the smallest differences, and again, you need to be careful, which test it is, where in fact, people have least choice, most poverty. Poverty is bad for cognitive development, female or male. And, you're not going to get much difference when you are at a floor effect. So these are all complicated issues. People say, can you tell me in 5 minutes the summary of sex differences, and I'll add and similarities in cognitive abilities? And I say, nope, won't do it. because the topic is far too complicated.
Yes, exactly. But I mean, you proposed the biopsychosocial model to study sex differences, and of course, it includes the biological part, and that is about evolution, the brain, hormones, and other stuff like that. So, I mean, these you also include these into the picture, the results of evolution, our brains might have evolved, perhaps some sexually dimorphic regions of the brain, how hormones operate in men and women, and things like that, right?
Sure, but remember also, there's a big controversy now, there's a whole big move to get rid of the term of sexually morphic brains. When you talk about sexually dimorphic, I should have said dimorphic, that means there's two distinct forms that vary by sex. It is much more useful to think of it as variations. One neuroscientist used the terms mosaics, different overlaps. But remember, not only have our brains evolved, but our societal pressures affect our brains. Our societal pressures affects the hormones that we secrete. If you have a small interest in, let's suppose you're a kid that loves reading, or maybe you're just predisposed to not move a lot. Well, then you sit and read, and then someone says, "Oh, look, little Ricardo loves books. Let's shower him with books." Then you get a greater interest, and so forth. We know that the brain is plastic. Plastic is a very important word in understanding the brain. And the idea is that our brains are plastic. Plastic is an extremely important word. That means that our brains change in response to our environment. And in fact, so do our genetic expressions. Epigenetics is one of the fastest growing fields right now. And it really has to do the way the genes express themselves as a result of our environment. So let's take, for example, lots of studies, for example, where a group of women who had never played video games spend, an hour a day for several weeks playing Tetris. Do you know what Tetris is? That game with the block ball. And then you can see the differences in their brain after this, training. And then when they stop, you can see it, disappear. I mean, our brains respond. There was a critical study done in London many years ago. London taxi drivers have larger hippocampi, the area of the brain that has to do with spatial relations. And the longer they drove taxis, the larger it was. So it was a dose-related kind of response. Our brains change in response to our environment. And when we change our environment, we change so many other things, so that we're actually continuously affecting all these variables. And a more holistic view like that one is much more useful than thinking about certain part heredity, certain part environment. That's a really old way of thinking. There's no single number that can express how important is the environment, how important is biology, because it varies across all of these things that we're measuring.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and so in terms of socialization, what are some of the most important aspects that you would like to refer to when we're dealing with sex differences and how they might arise?
Okay. Remember that we can increase them, we can create them, we can decrease them, we may even be able to eliminate them, and it depends on which ones. I mean, obviously, I'm not talking about differences in reproduction, because then this would just be a pretty silly kind of argument. But we're talking about cognition and learning and thinking. So among the things we want to do is we want to expose all of our children, boys and girls, to a variety of activities, a variety of people, a variety of toys, given plenty of choice to develop areas where they don't even know they exist. As you may know, I have been a strong opponent of single-sex schooling. I wasn't initially, I used to say early on when people asked me that question that there are no cognitive reasons for single-sex schooling. And then I came to learn that really it's much worse than I thought. The data are clear. There are no advantages to single-sex schooling. There's huge meta-analysis, over 1 million people involved. There were no advantages. That's not my work. Those are other people's work. So what happens is we say single-sex schooling, we say girls learn one way, boys learn another way. Well, that says all girls are the same and all boys are the same. Some girls really need a lot of activity. Some boys are doing just fine sitting and reading and writing poetry. They don't need to go outside and throw a basketball to learn their multiplication table. So when we start divvying up people by groups, we lose the individuality. Individuals are different, but when we ignore the overlap, and we have a lot to learn from each other. Our world is increasingly diverse in so many ways. In terms of backgrounds, in terms of race, in terms of SES status, in terms of our cultural and political beliefs, and separating out half of the world during formidable learning years, you're losing an awful lot of very important learning. In the U.S. military, for example, we now have women going into submarines. So they're spending long periods of time in largely with huge groups of men in essentially an island. And where do they learn to respect each other? Where do they learn how to work together? Where do they learn how to cooperate with each other if that isn't done consistently throughout our childhood and early adult years? So I really feel strongly that that's a mistake.
Mm-hmm. Okay, at a certain point there you refer to reproduction, and I would like to ask you about that because, there are people who, for example, when they're talking about the many factors that go into the gender wage gap, they refer to one of them as being the fact that when women hit their late 20s or perhaps their early 30s, they get into a point where they want to have children and perhaps they prefer having part-time occupations instead of full-time, and many of them simply, if they have the chance, of course, want to leave the job market. So perhaps what I would like to ask you here is if studying sex differences in cognitive abilities and in interests in this case would also help, for example, women to strike a better balance between their work and their personal lives.
Okay, great question. I do actually have a book on that with my colleague, Fanny Chung, Women at the Top. Professional women, tell us how they manage to handle, care responsibilities. In fact, the majority of care responsibilities do fall to women. Care responsibilities is increasingly not just children. People have elderly parents, people have ill siblings. We care for all sorts of people in our society. How do we handle the caring needs, which are important, and our work needs? First, most women cannot afford to leave the workplace. It is somehow we act as though this is a choice for, around the world. And there's going to be presumably some prince at home who is bringing in enough money to pay the rent and pay the health insurance and buy the food. And that simply is not a reality for most people. Ask poor women about this, and they'll just laugh at you because generations of poor women have always worked. Women has also always worked in ways that were often not recognized in the official statistics. They were often paid, quote, under the table. They were often in family businesses, working in farms. Now, work-family conflict is a very real phenomenon. Women report more of the conflict than men do. That stress of both. But increasingly, men are reporting work-family conflict too. One way, several ways of handling this. One is, for example, universal child care. U.S. is probably one of the worst countries in the world on that measure. The U.S. is also one of the worst countries in the world in terms of maternity and paternity leave. So I'm certainly not with any national pride that I'm bringing these data to light. But in countries that have good child care, good maternity and paternity leave, the stress is a lot less and you have a lot more equality. So there is a long way for us to go. And the fact that somehow women are managing it better is probably not true. All of those women working at blue-collar jobs, they're not waiting on tables, for the most part, because they love the work. They need the money. Women who are cleaning your houses, the women who are working in hospitals, these are all traditional women's occupations. And wants men also to have more equal role in child rearing. That's to men's benefit. Lots of good data that having an active role in child rearing is important for men's health and development. These are things to aspire toward.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so from all of what you've just said, I guess that I already know the answer you will going to give about this next question, but I would like to ask you anyways, because there are people that say in this case that perhaps because there are some cognitive differences, some sex differences in cognitive abilities, that perhaps it would be wise in some way to bring back same-sex schooling. But I mean, does that make any sense?
It suggests that everybody would be the same, all females are the same, all males are the same, and they need to learn separately. That is certainly not true. There are plenty of males who will not fit well in an all-male environment, or girls, in the traditional all-girl environment, and we have much to learn from each other. In terms of those differences, let me address them head-on. First, I know you would ask one of your questions about IQ and intelligence. It would seem as though it would be very easy to say who's the smarter sex, get a random sample of females and males of some age, give them an IQ test, a standardized intelligence test, and see who has the higher score. The problem with that is that the scores were written, the tests were written to show no sex differences. So if during the development of the test, there were some items that, let's say, more women got correct than men during the test development, it would either be balanced with something that more males got correct or be eliminated. So we can't just give IQ tests. Now, you may be familiar with some of the work of some of the other psychologists in this area. Just one second. For example, Arthur Jensen. Arthur Jensen is no longer with us. He's recently deceased, but a very controversial figure in intelligence. Some of his work on race differences in intelligence, were horrendous. But he did, Lerner and Like, a study of a number of tests that had not been normed to show no differences. And here is his conclusion, and I'm going to quote, where Arthur Jensen has said that, the differences are near zero. Now, there are some group differences on individualized tests. Some of the differences are large, some are small, and some have existed across a lot of time. So let's consider one of the largest, and that has to do with, you probably heard of mental rotation, a kind of visual spatial task, where on average, men tend to score higher than women. So, all right, that's an interesting fact. Evolutionary psychologists might have been one to say, well, that's because men were the hunters in hunter-gatherer societies, and they went long distances. I think that that's a bad explanation. I think it ignores the reality of so many years and so many types of hunter-gatherer societies. These were not farmers, these were gatherers. The women had to travel long distances. to find various kinds of food sources that were ripe at different seasons of the year. The women in a number of hunter-gatherer societies where, in fact, women did participate in hunting. And I think it just misrepresents, it gives us an easy answer to a complicated question. So, with lots of reasons here where I find that evolutionary argument. Also, many of the things that we're measuring now, like reading, did not exist in hunter-gatherer societies. So, and we do adapt. You don't go out in the morning and kill your bison for your dinner. Probably, anyway. You're more likely to pick your grapes for your wine. So that there have been so many, it ignores all of those years that have intervened. So, of course, I believe in evolution. It's not a belief system. I think it's a pretty evidentiary science, but using it as an explanation for everything we find, I find just silly. So there are some of those differences. So on average, we also know it's absolutely clear, lots and lots of data, that in fact people can learn to improve on all of these areas. With education, with training, everyone can get better in these skills. And that's an important message to keep in mind also. On average, do males have more spatial experiences? Yes. Do they select them based on their interests? Probably. And that's where you get us back into those loops. Are they real? They're real on average. But there are plenty of women with exceptional spatial skills. Someone has argued that one of the reasons that women are absent from some areas of science, they're not absent, they are at parity virtually in areas like biology, increasingly so in medicine. Veterinary school in the US and other places is like 75% female. So it isn't like women can't do science. But one of the, to say that they are not in some of these professions because of low spatial ability ignores the reality of what those careers are like. They have to be able to write, they have to be able to read complex information, they have to be able to work in laboratory groups, they have to gain money for their work. So yes, spatial skills is part of it, but it's one of many skills. And many of those skills are ones where, on average, women are excelling.
Mm-hmm. Okay, very well. So let's now move on to the second part of the interview, that is about critical thinking and the work you've done on that issue. So first of all, what is critical thinking for you, and what sorts of tools does it include?
Sure. Critical thinking at the broadest level, to thinking about it, is using those cognitive skills and abilities that increase the probability of a desirable outcome. Nothing, the future is uncertain. We can do things that increase the likelihood that we'll get an outcome we want. It is purposeful. It's something we're doing deliberately. It's reasoned. It's goal-directed. So, for example, if you're solving a problem, if you're formulating an inference from some text, if you're calculating likelihood, if you're making a decision, those are all examples of using critical thinking. We can all get better, and we can get better with education and with constant practice. Assessing likelihood and uncertainty, real important. We can learn how to do that better. We can understand how cause is determined. So if I want to say, for example, here's one that I've heard. There's been a huge increase in juvenile crime since women went to work. That's a causal statement. Well, there's so much wrong with that, including the fact that the data don't exist. But so many other things have changed during that period of time. And the data are wrong. There's no increase in juvenile crime, but that doesn't keep people from saying it. Determining credibility, very, very important in the internet age. You can go to a website, it looks good, you're reading, it looks scholarly. I went to one website, I was reading about Martin Luther King, and it looked like a good site. And then a couple paragraphs in, it was clear this was a racist hate website. But it was not one that you would, immediately pick up on when you saw, the first glances. So it's really important. We need it to have an educated citizenry. We need it to have a democracy. We need it to understand global warming. What are the data? Are humans responsible? Or is it something, how do we come to understand it? What causes it? Is it real? So these are all examples of critical thinking.
Mm-hmm. Okay, very well. And I mean, these skills that you're talking about, they are all, general skills, right? They can be applied in any area, any scientific area. It is not the case that, for example, as some people say, that sometimes it happens that when students are taught to think in certain ways in a certain scientific area that they're studying, then those skills are not really transferred to other areas. But in this case, you're talking about general skills that can be applied in any area, right?
Yes, but often they don't transfer. And if we want them to transfer, we need to teach it in ways that transfer. I am certain that just about every viewer of this video can tell you that correlation is not cause. And I'm willing to bet money that if I sat at their kitchen table and they read that children who go to preschool are better readers than those who don't, they'd say, see, preschool is good for reading. Well, it may very well be, but only the richer kids went to preschool. So, how many of them recognize it in context? But we can learn to recognize it in context. We can learn to recognize it in history. We can learn to recognize it in science. We can learn to recognize it in public policy by practicing that skill across domains. And that is, transfer is not something magic. We have to make it happen. But we have plenty of good data that it can happen when it's taught in ways that make it transfer.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so we always have to do the effort of continually applying and practice these skills in the very different areas that we deal with, right?
Absolutely. And we have to be willing to, discuss these issues broadly. We have to be willing to recognize our own limitations, and we have to be willing to continue to learn. I hope that I will continue to become a better thinker as I grow. Nobody, it's not you have it or you don't have it, but it's really a matter of, and it's effortful. You said, you have to, good thinking is hard. I've had some students come in and they say they're tired, they did a lot of homework, and their parents say, how can you be tired? You sat at a table all day, you didn't lift heavy boxes. They don't understand the effort of deep cognition.
Mm-hmm. Yes, exactly. And why is it so effortful for us to acquire these skills? Is it because they don't come naturally to us? That is, we have to work against our natural cognitive proclivities in terms of biases and heuristics and other types of intuitions that perhaps we have evolved but no longer really favor us in modern industrialized societies?
Sure. A lot of reasons that it's difficult. First, I've heard lots of people will say, I have a bad memory, or I just can't do math. I've never heard anyone say, I'm a bad thinker. Never heard it out of anyone's mouth. In part, that's because we don't ever get that kind of feedback we would need to know that would tell us how often we're right, how often we're wrong. You would need that immediate kind of feedback for your decisions and your thinking. We never have it. So we tend to think we're pretty good. We also have a whole host of biases and self-serving beliefs. So, a lot of people have, my country is the best, period. And then that's going to cut me off to hearing, really thinking critically about the issues that are important. Or that political party is just, wants to raise taxes all the time, period. And so it shuts us off in our beliefs. We also have a whole host of cognitive biases. halo effects, and much of this is not intuitive. Understanding probability and likelihood is not intuitive. I taught stat a lot of years, taught stat many years, and I could tell you how many times I've said things about gambler's fallacy, and yet a little teeny piece inside of me keeps saying, but shouldn't that number come up more frequently? It seems intuitively, and this is someone who knows better, teaches better, but a little piece of me still keeps saying, doesn't seem like that should be so. We're not used to dealing with large samples. We prefer a story. I spoke before a committee in Congress, the U.S. Congress, and I was talking about critical thinking and education, and all the way there, the aide is telling me, don't use too many numbers, it confuses them. Oh my God, this is I'm talking, this was not a good story. Tell them a good story. And I envision like all of Congress sitting on my lap while I'm rocking or something. Don't give them too much data. Tell them a good personalized story about how this helped an individual. And that's really how we're wired. We love personalized stories. We trust our own experience. And why should I trust data on 20,000 strangers? I never even met these people. So it's not an intuitive sort of thing, but it can be learned and it can be appreciated. And we can all continue to get better. And it's something that I have an incredible passion for. I think it's very, very important. The jobs of the future depend on it. Robots, automation is going to be taking away huge numbers of jobs. We need to retrain those people into the human cognitive jobs that the machines can't take. So we need to replace them and give them with the decision-making skills, their ability to handle complex data, to save their jobs, to save their income, and to improve our society.
Mm-hmm. Okay, right. So perhaps just one last controversial question, that is critical thinking related also to creativity? Because and I'm asking also because, for example, there are people, some of whom I've already talked to, that say that creativity can't really be learned, that it is a trait that is at least partly heritable, and some people say that, for example, creativity is highly correlated with trait openness to experience from the big five, and so since our personality traits are partly heritable, then at least around 50% of it is genetic or something around that. So what would you have to say about that?
Oh, a lot. Starting out with the 50% is heritable. I would say that is a ridiculous number, that there's no single number, that people are creative among multiple dimensions. If you're a poor person and you're making your money last till the end of the month, that's creative. We don't recognize it as such. Yes, we have personality traits, and actually critical thinking is correlated with openness to experience. We have to be willing to accept. In my definition, which helps us to use cognitive ideas in order to get a better outcome, creativity would be included. Can it be learned? Well, if I wanted to create a painter, if I wanted to create a creative dancer, we would send you to school. We wouldn't, you would go, the likelihood, in modern times, might not have been true a long time ago, of you're becoming a creative dancer, a creative artist, a creative scientist, you name it. You can be a creative accountant, whatever it is. You're going to go to school. You're going to learn the rules. And then you're going to decide, once you learn them, how to break them and when to break them in your own ways. But it's not that it can't be learned. I mean, if you've not gone to school, you're not going to. It's just you have to have. We give our most creative musicians the best musical training, and which is what we do for all of our creative arts.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so just before we go, do these skills of critical thinking have anything to do with sex differences? I mean, it seems obvious to me at least that both boys and girls, men and women can equally acquire these skills, correct?
We don't find, and I have the Halpern critical thinking assessment been used widely. It even exists in Portuguese. In fact, we have not found any overall sex differences. And you really wouldn't expect it. It really has to do with how you cut up the cognitive domain, whether you're going to find some, where and when you might find differences. But these are not the kinds of things that would have been based on differential rearing or those sorts of things. So certainly we have no data for it. If the samples get large enough, no matter what you have, you're going to get differences. I mean, that's just a fact of statistics. But you want to look at the effect size, and we just don't have to say it. No reason to believe it's there. Anyone who has said that these are reasons for voting for or against female or male political leaders, corporate officers, the data are simply not there.
Mm-hmm. Okay, very well. So, Diane, would you like perhaps to tell people what are some of the best online sources for them to get in touch with your work?
Sure. I have a website, dianehalpern.com, and certainly have lots of references there. I have many books, and certainly if anyone wants to write to me at diane.halpern@cmc.edu, I will respond. I can't try not to let it back up, but I respond to everyone. Although I don't, people keep going 10, 12 times, I stop. But I will respond to everyone. I think it's important that we be civil about our controversies, that we be willing to listen to each other, and that we be willing to find some common ground. That's one in decision making and problem solving. You often find that people who are in disagreement, you dig a little deeper. They both want something that's the same, and you can build from there. And stay evidence-based, stay data-based, and remember that we're all individuals. And if we want to know who is smarter, women or men, you need to really ask which woman, which man. And actually, I'm quoting here from someone else, but it's important to know that, we're individuals and we treat each other as such.
Mm-hmm. Okay, very well. That's a very good message to end the show on. So, Diane, I will be leaving links in the description box to all of your work for people to go check it out if they want. And again, thank you a lot for taking the time to come on the show. It was really a pleasure to everyone.
My pleasure. Great to meet you, Ricardo. Be well.
Hi guys, thank you so much for watching this video until the end. I would also like to ask you to please pay a visit to my Patreon page and see if you can make a pledge there. I would really be thankful for that. And finally, I would also like to give a huge thank you to my patrons Karen Litzke, Anne Blanche, Per Helga Larsen, Lau Guerrero, Chantal Gelinas and Jim Frank. Thank you a lot for all.